Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. How are you guys? We're back with another Omaha video. I think it's the third in the series that we're doing this week on this fine city. The first one was an overview. The second one was a look at the very early days of Omaha. And now we're going to talk about, let's call it the pioneer days, which is kind of like 18, 20, 30, 40, right in there. And as usual, this is not a serious video. If you came here from the Google machine or YouTube looking for a real video about Omaha, this is not the one. This is a parody video that I'm going to make up off the top of my head. So the thing about Omaha is that, believe it or not, guys, Council Bluffs, Iowa, which is across the Missouri River in Iowa, was really the town of focus, the bigger place, the more developed area, the community that was really more prominent, and Omaha was sort of just an outpost and empty land, really. But of course, across the river in Omaha, they had a saloon, they had a little hotel there. You know, it had some buildings and some people, but really Council Bluffs was the metropolis of the area. And so they kind of looked down on Omaha. And Omaha, of course, was one of the early centers of moving cattle from the cattle drives out back east. So the stockyards were real big, and of course, the puffy shirted suit wearing fancy pants in Council Bluffs kind of looked down on the stockyard crew, and hence that's why you had the Council Bluffs Omaha wars of those early years in the 1820s, predominantly shooting cannonballs at each other all day, all night for 2-3 weeks at a time. Then they'd go into like a little bit of a peace, calling off the dogs, and then next thing you know, the cannonballs are flying again, and they're back in it. They had peace talks, broke down time after time after time. But finally, they got their heads together because of what? Why? What was the reason that the Council Bluffs Omaha wars wore down and eventually ended? And it comes down to, as it always does, comes down to money. In this case, real estate. So some smart people in Council Bluffs looked across the water. They go, what are we doing? We need to start plotting that land and get it ready to sell. And in those days, what you might call a plot or a claim wasn't what you might consider the normal place for a house today, like an acre, a half acre, whatever it is. We're talking 160 acres was basically your average claim. And if you were qualified, meaning just about anybody, could stake a claim. You would go out to an area that was unclaimed, and you'd say, okay, I'll take this one right here. So like I said, some smart people in Council Bluffs built a ferry to go across the water to take speculators and settlers from Council Bluffs across the Missouri to look around and eventually stake a claim and get that area moving. And this is what ultimately made Omaha grow so fast. It eventually dwarfed Council Bluffs. And Council Bluffs has tried different things over the years to grow and overtake Omaha again. But of course, once you get a few McDonald's built into a community and a few 7-Elevens and maybe a Hy-Vee food store and a few liquor stores, well, I mean, you're on your way. And then the other town gets left behind. But so back to the real estate, that is what they started to do. And they would take people across the water and they'd say, all right, take a look around and stake your claim. And then, there was different rules on how you could maintain that claim. You couldn't just say, I'll take that plot of land and then not do anything with it. You had to show up. You had to build on it or raise cattle on it or do something. That wasn't a hard and fast rule, but it was kind of an accepted practice that showed that you were serious about, using that land that you claimed. And so, it just got to be, at a certain point, a land rush, just like any other desirable area of anywhere. When a lot of people want a small portion of land and they want their little slice of it, well, what happens? The price goes up. And it wasn't so much that the price went up, is that the pressure on you to not only stake your claim, but maintain your claim, they called it. And really what that meant was building a house on it. And so people were staking claims so fast, they didn't have time to build a house because they wanted to run over and stake another claim. So what they would do is, especially the big Catholic families, they would leave a kid or two and build a lean-to using fir tree branches. They'd build a lean-to and they'd leave a couple kids on each claim. So you have these kids, 6, 7-year-olds, roaming around on 160-acre plots in the early days of Omaha, in the 1820s, 1830s, after the Omaha Council Bluffs Wars. And so, sometimes they actually forgot the kids were there. And the kids ended up raising their own cattle. You'd have 8, 9-year-olds that realize their parents aren't coming back because they probably forgot about them. When you're a big Catholic family of 40, 50 kids, sometimes you lose a few. And that's what would happen. They'd leave these kids. They'd say, kids, stay here. We're going to go get some more property, and we're going to drop these kids all over Omaha, and then eventually we'll come back and we'll build a house here, and you guys can live in it. Well, when you're 6, 7 years old and a couple years go by and you've been raising corn on your own plot of land and your parents never come back, you go, well, this is it. You look at each other and go, all right, let's build a house. And so you had 8, 9, 10-year-olds building homes in the early days of Omaha. And sometimes their parents never came back. Sometimes their parents came back 20 years later and said, hey, we're back. Glad you built this house. We'll take it. And the kids would be like, what are you talking about? You left us alone for 20 years. Now we're 28, 29 years old. You can go hit the hay, hit the road. Or sometimes they welcomed him with open arms, with the total forgiveness that many people carry in their hearts. And there was a reunion, there was a party, they had piñatas, they had a chocolate fountain, they had champagne bottles stacked up 400 or 500 feet tall, and it was a celebration. But that's how Omaha started to grow. And these speculators, they weren't dumb. They knew how to get a city going with some greed, and that was the idea that people wanted to get their claim started because they knew the real estate prices were going to rise eventually, and they didn't necessarily have to stick around. I mean, if they get tired in 5 years of their claim in Omaha, they could sell that baby. And remember, in those days, a lot of these plots were right around what is considered downtown today. So it was a very centralized location right there on the water. And what did you have on the Missouri River? You had trade, you had goods and services that were being traded up and down the river, all the way down to the Mississippi, out the Mississippi, into the Gulf of Mexico, and to points all over the globe. From India to Africa to South America, Antarctica, they were all buying goods that were produced right there in Omaha. And what were some of those goods? You had corncob pipes, made right there in Omaha. Cuckoo clocks, made right there in Omaha. You had those little plastic discs on the road that kind of go bump, 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 bump when you go over them with your tire. Those were made right there in Omaha, 1840s. The handle on the washer at a laundromat. Not the door, not the top loader. I'm talking about the side loader with those doors that look like bank vaults. Well, those handles were made right there in Omaha. The gates on a liquor store security gate that they pulled down when the place is closing for the night. Those were made in Omaha. Some bike tires were made in Omaha. You had street lights made in Omaha. You made dog collars. You had all kinds of stuff that they used on the prairie that were also needed and loved and appreciated around the world, depending on the product, depending on the country. And so that's why that land started to grow so fast in value, is because Omaha was becoming a thing. Now you have industry, now you have schools, now you have services, now you have churches. And when you have churches, you have Friday night church dances. And when you have church dances, you have romances, and you have families and marriages and families and kids, and you start to grow a town. And once you grow a town, now you can finally have a parade. And in 1845, the first Omaha Pride Parade, and it didn't mean today what it means now, but back then it was just a pride in the city is what they were communicating. The Omaha Pride of Nebraska Parade. Now, the problem was you only had probably 1,000 people in the whole town. Well, I mean, what they would start at one end. In other words, everybody in the city has to participate in the parade, take turns being in the parade and take turns being on the sidelines of the parade. Otherwise, you don't have a parade because you don't have enough people. And they got every donkey, every elephant, every giraffe, every tiger, every beaver, every animal they could find. A parakeet, they could find a snake in one of the farms. They'd say, "Come on, snake, get in this parade." And you had a group of probably 40, 50 snakes that could play the trumpet, play the tuba, doing a sort of a marching band act. And that's because they were calling on everybody to be in the parade. Every animal they could think of. They were inventing robots in those days just to have them be in the parade. They were inventing what they called mechanical men. They didn't call them robots then. They called them mechanical men made of old washer and dryer parts. And they ran on steam, little steam engines, and that's what they put in the parade to play various marching tunes that everybody knows of today that started in those days. So in other words, you had a young, vibrant, growing town that did have some setbacks, did have some problems. They had some crime. Because remember, even in the very early days, as I described before, you had people flying through the saloon windows in 1804 in Omaha once a day. Like I said before, the glass man would come every morning and replace the glass in the saloon. And then, sure enough, there'd be another fist fight over somebody drew an ace when that ace wasn't even supposed to be in the deck, so they obviously cheated, and the guns would start flying, the fists would start flying, and people would go flying through the plate glass windows of the saloon. And then here comes the glass man the next morning and fixing the glass. So in other words, violence and crime were always a part of the Old West, and certainly all through the 1800s. And so those were some of the growing pains that Omaha had to deal with. I mean, you had thieves. I mean, you had guys stealing pencils. These kids would go to the one-room schoolhouse in Omaha, and they had eventually they had 2 or 3 of them. But these thieves would come up behind the kids and steal their pencil. Well, you can't write anything. You know, they didn't have Bic pens. They didn't have fountain pens. They didn't have Pilot pens or any. They had pencils. So if somebody steals your pencil, you can't write anything. You can't write with your finger paint. That's not going to work. So, they eventually accosted some of those pencil thieves, and they made them write on the walls of the prison, "I will never steal pencils again," 1,000, 2,000, 450,000 times on the walls of the prison. A couple of those guys died mid-sentence. Because they were writing that same sentence for 40, 45 years, and eventually their ticker gave out. Some of them died long after the students that they stole the pencils from died. It was just that kind of an era where people could die at any age because they didn't have the medical care, they didn't have the science, they didn't have the knowledge. I mean, they didn't even have Tic Tacs. I mean, you had people eating steaks right off the grill, and then they didn't have any breath mints. And they're walking around telling these long-ass stories and getting their bad breath on everybody. It was just a fiasco in that department. But that is really the story of the pioneer era, we'll call it, of Omaha in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, just after the Omaha Council Bluff Wars cooled off, and people started saying, "Geez, we got to quit fighting and start making some money out here." because the settlers kept coming from the east, and Omaha grew and grew and grew. So guys, that's a quick snapshot of the Pioneer era. We're going to have so